would love to share with you today something which touches me very deeply, movingly in history of music. There was once upon a time a spiritual father for a spiritual son, Haydn for Mozart. They nourished in inspiration each other. When Haydn was born, Mozart not yet. When Mozart died, Haydn survived decades. This, in the late 18th century, was unusual length of life for Haydn, but to the price of how many bitter awarenesses. Generally, when you have a teacher figure, mentor figure, he or she influences the pupil. A pupil can be intuitively genius person without so much need to learn, other than perhaps the basis of the know-how. One always speculates about the fact that Mozart studied contrapoint with Padre Martini, but how long? It wasn't courses of years in universities or even privately. It was a few lessons. How did Bach learn his contrapoint? By copying music of others. He was abandoned by all, being an orphan, even by his older family members who took more or less care of him. So he was a self-made man. So is Schubert. The power of their intuitive genius, combined with the fact that the tonal system was a common shared game where the rules were all for all. And then some customized them and some didn't, or differently. But nobody broke the table and said, tabula rasa, clean slate. We'll start from scratch with a new musical alphabet. No. So perhaps combined with the fact that Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me some composers don't need to change the musical language which they receive as an inheritance to express what they have to say. And others do. The Picassos, the Stravinskys, the people who constantly evolve in their art form according to their beliefs or for different fashion situations or traveling and exoticism. Whatever reason, philosophical, Dadaism, Cubism, call it. But some never changed. Look, Rachmaninoff. He was completely aware about atonalism, posttonalism, serialism, and all the isms. That didn't change anything in his musical output as a composer. So, for some, it's not necessary to revolutionize, so to say, the language in order to make a statement of their own inner musical world, narrative storytelling, philosophic statement, experience of life, or any spiritual uplifting through music that is to reach into our own intimate, most intimate, that's what I meant to say. That is to do with religion, with hope, with behavior, with music for reflection, music for spiritual uplifting. And when it comes to this story between a transmission of a fatherly figure such Haydn was for Mozart. It's almost as if the two recognized each other, despite of the generational difference. When Mozart wrote his first many series of quartets, he chose to call them children of Haydn and his by the dedication to his master. Oh, he called him master, but I don't think that any of the two were unaware that Haydn didn't teach much to Mozart and Mozart didn't learn much from Haydn. It's more exactly like as if they recognized each other for what triggers their musical being, to express a deep sense of philosophic humanity experience and hope through not fearing but choosing one's destiny and not fearing the ruler, even if the rulers are in the name of God, but being in the age of enlightenment, the ones who define their own destiny. Now, I'm not sure that Mozart and Haydn sat down and spoke philosophy for hours. Perhaps they did, after all. Can always fantasize if that is what takes us to imagine how they were. But I here want to share with you a very specific example, which really touches me and moves me a lot, about the relation of the elder and the younger in a trade, and how it's not always one way between the one who knows to the one who learns, but it's also from the one who transcends and the other one who, even if with more experience and older, realizes, because perhaps only he or she, in the case of Haydn is he, could see the real transcendental value of Mozart. And I speak about the string quartet K421 in D minor by Mozart, written in 1783-1785. Now we know that Mozart dies in 1791. Now we also talk about the D minor string quartet by Haydn, written in 1795, after Mozart's death, called the Fifths. And when I will play for you the first bars of both, I think you'll figure out why the logical thought that Mozart was inspired by Haydn in this style of dramatic D minor with chordal repetitivity of the accompaniment dramatization and a melodic line that is singing with absolute disdain for frivolity. Everything is dramatic and, to a certain extent, drastic. No niceties. And D minor is the tonality, of course, is to do with the strings instruments, but also with the fact that it's a tonality Mozart used in his Requiem, Beethoven in his Ninth Symphony, not to mention in his Tempest Sonata. So we can always speculate that tonalities are relative since they didn't have common tuning agreement, and the perfect pitch must have been relative by essence for the trade, the tunings, the instruments. But the 104th Symphony by Haydn, it's also in D minor. And you come to think Mozart's Concerto 466 is in D minor. And Don Giovanni, opera of Mozart, premiered in Prague, is also in D minor. Coincidence, atmosphere, perhaps that's the fashion of the day. You write dramatic pieces or pieces with a philosophic meaning that shake you to your roots in D minor. Fine. But to go back to our two quartets, Now I will play for you first the Mozart one with a purpose, not first the Haydn one. Sorry for tricking you, but it was for the good purpose. I switched from the one to the other in the hope that it was seamless as possible to prove my point. When you hear Haydn's quartet called the Fifths, Opus 76, number 2, and Mozart's K421. Years separate them in the composition, but Beethoven yet budding, Haydn already mature and possibly old for the time period of then, Mozart dead between the two pieces. And that's why I find it so touching. So forgive me for not being very musicologically objective and distant with the elements that I'm presenting, because they overtake me deeply emotionally. I imagine old Father Haydn missing Mozart, who passed by his life like a revelation and perhaps a celestial object that was so intense. Perhaps they mirrored their souls and then disappeared. And I can imagine in the older age Haydn being nostalgic, never sharing it. His music is always so marvelously formal. After all, we owe him the sonata form. But for a man to write such a reminiscence of what could have been his spiritual son's quartet, it takes all the same elements of the atmosphere, the mood, the repeated notes, which already Mozart uses for the chords in accompaniment for his Sonata K310. But that is more percussive as the instrument early fortepiano was. But this is quartet, same setting. Not harpsichord, fortepiano, piano. You can always argue, and it's true, with Beethoven especially, who grew up with the fortepiano from 1800 onwards, writing his 32 sonatas in 27 years or a little less. The Tempest Sonata is in D minor by Beethoven. I was telling you about the 466 concerto by Mozart. Premiered in February 1785 in Vienna, with Mozart improvising the piano part with the score parts copied almost still with the wet ink, literally. And this complexity syncopated with dramatic chromaticisms in D minor is so reminiscent of the opening of his overtures of Don Giovanni. This can be said also because of the same 1785. It must have been so meaningful to Haydn to find in Mozart this perhaps is better than him, but with the gratitude and not the arrogance of the young towards him for Mozart. Earlier I spoke to you about the 104th Symphony by Haydn. It's also in D minor. And in the early sonatas of Beethoven, the 7th in D major, which has this jubilant first movement, finishing, has a second movement in D minor. And how does he finish that movement, Beethoven? 151, you would say everybody does in tonal system, with the acciatura under the dominant, and again that G sharp. In his typical way, Beethoven uses the leading tone with the tonic and not to create even more of a provoked dissonance of expression of pain. And how does the introduction of the 104th Symphony by Haydn, which I just played the beginning of earlier, that's how the introduction ends. So what was Beethoven doing in the midst of this? He had different plans budding in him. People sometimes think it's because of his ego. I think it's because he was just Prometheus in person for the time being then. In fact, he's not the prolongation of Haydn, if Mozart was ever, but so much more. Beethoven appears to comply with the elements of Haydn and Mozart. After all, Vienna is still Haydn's and Mozart's when Beethoven comes to age. And Schubert, in the same city, in his corner, so much admires Beethoven. And how can you not? Because the Beethoven that we admire is not the Beethoven of the Haydn early era when he studied with him, more or less than more. But mostly, he's the one who deconstructed all this tradition. He broke with the form, he broke with the tonal rules, he broke with the modulations, he broke with the expected rapport of tonalities with the relative minor. He went for unexpected rapports. He was daring, the audacity of which might not be so obvious today, given what we've heard since, being composed in terms of rapport of dissonance and consonance, to say the least. But nevertheless. And I find that it is incredible for us to be able to have the distance enough in time to be aware of how and what their trajectories were artistically, creatively, disrespectfully for what they received, especially Beethoven. If you play the earlier sonatas, like the first slow movement of Beethoven, I'm sorry, that was Freudian slip in my presentation. Can call this still gallant, and Mozart in his K310 slow movement now that's quasi the same. I think both Mozart and Beethoven in the slow movement of their sonatas are really Haydnians, to call it as it is. Now, how would have Mozart developed his creative juices beyond the age of 36 or so? That's the question. How would have Schubert developed his creative outlook beyond age 40? Or Chopin, for that matter. Those are the big question marks. So far for Haydn, I find very touching that this old man is writing a quartet which is an homage to his former protégé. Not so much to the man, I think really to the music itself. And Mozart back. And Haydn back. As far far as the grace notes are concerned, I have concerns about them, because there must be a reason for which they used more ink to mark grace notes than equal eighth notes, even if we assume that the tradition was to play half of the value. Even in the famous D major sonata by Beethoven. Therefore, in Haydn's quartet, yes, it's an appoggiatura. Yet less melodic when you play it tight, and more playful, more catchy, more spicy. Because it's a note for another. That's what an appoggiatura is, from above, appoggiare, to lean over the note. Mozart. Johann Christian Bach. That was before Mozart, by the way. Another of those inverted lineages. The royal Mozart child met Johann Christian, last son of Bach, Johann Sebastian, who gave him his sonatas, and Mozart made them into, at least half of them, into a concerto under his name. D minor. The tonality chosen by Mozart for his Requiem. There is a mysticism beyond the seriousness or the austerity of the musical language chosen through a given tonality. Subjective choices of a tonality perhaps are connected subconsciously or even consciously to pieces which are marking them. I find it very touching and moving again that old Daddy Haydn, who was so generous, he composed the farewell symphonies, Union's protests for his orchestra musicians to be not paid decently by the Esterhazy family that employed him to conduct them, for whom or through whom they premiered these 100 and more symphonies, as well as leaving in his will that at a specific address in Vienna, a yearly sum is deposited anonymously to an old lady who is, according to him, the last daughter of Johann Sebastian Bach at an old age. And he writes that to be done anonymously, as well as he adds, because we owe her father everything. Isn't that touching, moving, humble? When you are Haydn, he was most revered. And to keep such generous humility, and I think musically addressing such a beautiful message to say the teacher is also influenced by the student in the case of this quartet. Because if you don't know, you would think logically, if such kinship, it has to come from the master to the student. And when they say the teacher learns from the student, students usually don't believe it until they become teachers. It's a wheel of life spinning. Bring it forward to the next, to the following. Adapt, adjust, modernize, imagine, be iconoclastic, fight the status quo, don't accept it if it's what drives you to express yourself for what it's meaningful, spiritually, philosophically, ethically. Why these composers like Haydn, who had to write industrial quantity of music to survive in an impossible contract of obligations, of music production, he never gave up to write simplistic. Easy go, easy run, easy composed, easy rehearsed, easy performed. Not that they ever rehearsed, really, they read, as they used to say. But no, and Haydn, and Mozart, and Beethoven. Well, Beethoven to a lesser case because he was not obliged to compose so much music by a contract. It was more private donors and patrons who financed him so he can compose works for them, or and Mozart with the Masons, and who he composed for in the later part of his life. There are these societies of course, the top elite of the educated and the rich of the 18th century who could afford the luxury to have the time. And I think that that touches me very much, and I wanted to share it with you. That old Father Haydn composed a piece which is the twin in some aspects. Of course, not in all. And I didn't mean that as an idea that this has to be proven because I have this idea and then I want to prove it at any means, at whatever it takes. Obviously, there are differences, and it's not only that motivation, but the chronology of the events, the connection between the men, and more and most, the connection between their music, their language. These people lived for these creations, ephemeral as they were, lost for most of them to come to our time. And nevertheless, whatever we have through the written texts of theirs that have come to us, survived all these fires, wars, revolutions, is still unbelievable, of profound inspiration, meaningful spiritualism, and strict rules of music writing. You would think you'll produce something austere? Well, perhaps. What is frivolous perhaps changes within the time periods and the fashions. The ballet, the opera evolved compared to the oratorios and the cantatas or the motets before that. But I find that they left us such beautiful trace of what was really meaningful in their life, despite of all their personal, and they had many, troubles surviving. Thank you, Haydn. Thank you, Mozart. And thank you, all of them. They nourish our souls, our jobs, teaching them, our lives, serving them. And when I say them, every time is their music. But also, like now, taking the time to acknowledge this chronology of mirrored admiration between the master and the student.